April 1945. The war in Europe is breaking apart like the bones of an old machine. Columns of defeated troops shuffle through the wreckage of what was once the Third Reich. The spring air carries the sharp smell of damp earth, diesel fumes, and burned-out buildings. In a makeshift holding area near an abandoned German airfield, a group of young women in gray-green auxiliary uniforms stand behind barbed wire. Their hair is neat, their posture disciplined, but their faces carry a thin film of exhaustion. They are clerks, radio operators, switchboard attendants, fragments of a war machine now crumbling around them. Then, from beyond the fence, they see something they have never seen before. American jeeps roll in, kicking up a thin cloud of dust. Inside them, women. American women in uniform, confident, clean. Their jackets perfectly tailored, boots polished, caps tilted with effortless precision. They carry themselves not as servants of men but as soldiers of a nation. The German auxiliaries freeze. A silence spreads through the wire like static. Then it happens. Eyes widen. Hands tremble. Some bite their lips. Others look down, breaking their rigid formation. A few begin to cry. What they are seeing is not just a uniform. It is a life they were never allowed to live. To understand that moment of stunned silence in April 1945, we have to step back, years earlier, into the carefully engineered world of Nazi Germany. The Third Reich did not just build an army. It built a worldview, a strict architecture of who could lead, who could fight, and who could only serve. From the earliest years of Nationalsozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei rule, women were deliberately removed from public power. Their identity was narrowed to 3 words: Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church. Nazi propaganda glorified the woman as mother and caretaker, as the silent backbone of the family, but never as a soldier or decision-maker. This was not just cultural rhetoric. It was state policy. Under Adolf Hitler and his leadership circle, women were pushed out of universities, state offices, and leadership positions. Education for girls emphasized obedience, physical fitness for childbirth, and domestic skills, not professional ambition. By the time Europe was at war, Germany's female population had been trained to believe their worth was tied to their ability to raise strong sons for the Führer. Young girls entered the Bund Deutscher Mädel, BDM, the League of German Girls, where they learned discipline, loyalty, and traditional gender roles. They marched, they sang, they saluted, but they were never trained to fight. As the war intensified, practical necessity forced cracks into this ideological wall. By 1941, German men were bleeding on multiple fronts, from North Africa to the Eastern Front. Someone had to keep the machinery of war running behind the lines. And so, quietly, a second-tier structure emerged: the female auxiliaries. Officially, they were not soldiers. They were Helferinnen, helpers. Tens of thousands were recruited into the Luftwaffe, Wehrmacht, and SS support services. Their tasks were technical but tightly controlled: operating radios, decoding messages, filing reports, running communications lines, working in air defense command posts. They wore uniforms, but they were never meant to embody the uniform. Even their uniforms reflected their restricted place. The cut was plain, practical, and intentionally modest: skirts instead of trousers, low-heeled shoes, caps without the symbolic authority of a combat unit. Everything about their appearance was designed to signal that they were support, not equals. For many of these young women, this life was their world. They had been raised to admire the soldier, but not to be one. Their service was both patriotic duty and ideological obedience. The thought of women in another country commanding units, flying planes, or leading operations was almost unthinkable. Nazi propaganda reinforced that perception. State media portrayed Allied women as morally weak or corrupted, mocking the idea of female soldiers as a sign of Western degeneracy. In classrooms, in radio broadcasts, in the films screened in village halls, the idea was constant: a woman's strength was in silence, not command. And yet, even within this strict structure, these women formed the invisible backbone of Germany's war effort. Without their work in the Signals Corps, the Luftwaffe would have stumbled. Without their typing and filing, the Wehrmacht's immense bureaucracy would have seized up. They lived close to the heart of the war machine, yet always in its shadow. As the years dragged on, the cost of that shadow deepened. Many of these women saw men come and go, whole units wiped out on the Eastern Front. They saw the radio messages reporting retreats. They decoded the telegrams of death. They watched their country tighten its grip around a crumbling ideology, even as the Allied advance pressed closer. By late 1944 and early 1945, these auxiliaries were no longer the clean, idealized faces on propaganda posters. They were weary. Some were stationed near frontline command posts. Others were attached to anti-aircraft batteries, listening to the growing roar of American bombers overhead. Their world was collapsing around them, but their place within that world remained unchanged. They were trained to serve. They were never prepared to see another way, and that is why when the first American female soldiers rolled into captured German towns in 1945, those auxiliaries were not just seeing an enemy. They were seeing the impossible, made real in front of their eyes. While German women were locked into the role of Helferinnen, the story on the other side of the Atlantic followed a radically different path. In the years leading up to the war, the United States was no global military superpower. Its army was small, its public cautious, but the gears of mobilization began to turn fast after 1941. Factories roared to life. Industries expanded overnight. And alongside that expansion came something that would shake old gender boundaries: the enlistment of women. For the first time in U.S. history, women were not just encouraged to support the war from home. They were given uniforms, insignia, and structured military roles. In 1942, the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps was formed, later converted into the Women's Army Corps, WWII, granting its members full military status. That single decision changed the face of the American war effort. By the end of the war, over 150,000 women had served in the WAC alone. They worked in every major theater: North Africa, Italy, Britain, France, and eventually Germany. At the same time, the U.S. Navy WAVs recruited thousands of women into naval operations, taking over administrative communications and cryptographic work at shore stations. In the air, the Women Air Force Service pilots, WASP, flew aircraft across the continent, ferrying fighters and bombers to training fields and combat embarkation points. These women weren't just symbolic. They were operational. They wore trousers, boots, tailored jackets. Their uniforms were practical and proud. They carried rank insignia. They were trained, disciplined, and, most importantly, recognized by their own military as soldiers. American military leadership didn't adopt this approach out of ideology alone. It was necessity. Mobilizing millions of men for combat created gaps everywhere: communications, logistics, administration. Women stepped into those roles with speed and efficiency, often performing critical technical work that freed men to fight overseas. But something deeper was also happening: visibility. Unlike in Germany, where female auxiliaries were kept away from public spotlight, American women in uniform were seen. They marched in parades. They appeared on recruiting posters. Newspapers ran photographs of them boarding transports, decoding messages, or working in war rooms. Their image became part of the American war story. Their presence in Europe had a clear purpose. EOC units were deployed behind advancing U.S. armies to help establish field headquarters, communications hubs, and supply command posts. In liberated towns across France and Germany, American female personnel worked side by side with male officers. They spoke with local civilians, issued papers, and ran logistics centers. They were not hidden. They were in command posts, radios in hand, giving orders. To German eyes, especially female auxiliaries raised in the iron frame of Nazi gender ideology, this image was jarring. For years, they had been told that a woman's strength lay in submission and domestic duty, and now at the tail end of the war they saw women standing as equals in an enemy army. It wasn't just the uniforms. It was the way they walked, straight-backed, unapologetic, a sense of belonging in a world the German women had only been allowed to serve from the margins. These American women represented something almost unimaginable to those raised under the Reich: choice. They had chosen to serve, to wear the uniform, to be part of the war machine, not as servants, but as soldiers. Many of them were educated. Many held technical positions. Some flew planes. Others cracked codes. For the German auxiliaries who would eventually be captured in places like Frankfurt, Cologne or near airfields in central Germany. This would be the first time they had ever seen a woman wear power openly. The Nazi state had made sure they never saw such images before. Allied radio was banned. Foreign magazines were censored. Propaganda framed the enemy as decadent and weak. But war has a way of tearing down walls faster than any propaganda can hold them up. By 1945, as American columns pushed deeper into Germany, the inevitable happened. German female auxiliaries, many captured as part of retreating units or abandoned installations, were confronted face to face with their American counterparts. In that instant, history's behind that emotional shock lay another, colder truth. The American military used its female personnel far more strategically. German female auxiliaries were intentionally limited. They could not hold command positions. They could not operate independently. Their work was technical but subservient. For example, Luftwaffe female operators worked in anti-aircraft control rooms, relaying targeting data, but they never gave the orders. They were the voice, not the mind. By contrast, WWAC personnel often ran key communications networks at forward headquarters. They managed radio traffic. They operated switchboards. They coded and decoded messages at a scale Germany could not match without diverting men from the front. This gave the U.S. a significant tactical advantage. By 1944-1945, entire command posts in liberated French towns and newly occupied German zones were run, in part, by female communications teams. These units weren't symbolic. They were operational nodes in the Allied war machine. Many of these American women worked under pressure that mirrored frontline intensity. Some were stationed close enough to hear artillery fire. Others worked around the clock to maintain real-time coordination during major operations. From the build-up to Operation Overlord to the final Allied advance into Germany, German auxiliaries were aware of the scale of Allied communications superiority. They intercepted the signals. They heard the heavy, organized hum of the American network, but they didn't imagine that women could be part of that system. Propaganda had painted the enemy's army as chaotic, morally corrupt and weak. Now, as they looked across the fence at those calm, efficient American WWACs walking into field headquarters, the tactical imbalance became visible, almost physical. The Americans had built a war machine that didn't just rely on manpower, it leveraged human capacity, male and female. This was not just a cultural difference, it was a structural one. And the German auxiliaries knew deep down that their own side had shackled half its strength. The psychological undercurrent. Every war is also fought in the mind. The Nazi state had spent 12 years hammering a single narrative into its citizens. German superiority, male leadership, female devotion. It was not just a social order. It was a moral order, presented as unchangeable truth. For years, that belief held even under bombs, shortages, and loss. But ideology often dies quietly in small moments, not grand speeches. For many German auxiliaries, this was that moment. Watching American women confidently give instructions to male soldiers. Watching them walk with authority. Seeing them treated as equals. This cracked the ideological shell. It wasn't the front line that undid the Reich's most intimate fiction. It was the sight of an American woman wearing her rank openly. And the German auxiliaries understood something else too. If the Reich had denied them that power, it had denied them everything that came with it. Voice, choice, and future. The tears some of them shed that day were not just about defeat. They were about finally seeing the limits that had always been there. This was the first angle of collision between two worlds. Human, tactical, and psychological. But there was more beneath the surface, especially in how technology and leadership amplified those differences. Beneath the emotional shock and cultural divide lay a hard, measurable truth. War in the 1940s was no longer decided solely by who held the rifle. It was decided by who controlled information. Germany's war machine had been powerful, disciplined, and technologically advanced in its early years. But by 1944, it was straining. Bombings crippled transport lines, oil shortages strangled mobility, and communications were increasingly centralized, vulnerable, and overstretched. German female auxiliaries had been part of this delicate web. They operated field switchboards, manned radio rooms, and relayed urgent messages between command posts. They did this with skill and discipline, often under immense pressure. But the structure was rigid. Orders flowed from male officers downward. Innovation was rare. Improvisation discouraged. Women were trained to execute, not to decide. Across the battlefield, the U.S. military approached logistics differently. American strategy emphasized decentralization, redundancy, and flexibility. Women in the Women's Army Corps and U.S. Navy WAVs became an integral part of that system. They worked in signal intelligence, encryption, transportation control, supply chain coordination, and field administration. WWII units staffed switchboards that connected divisions to corps to armies, armies to supreme headquarters. Some worked in mobile command posts that advanced with the front. Others helped maintain air traffic and convoy scheduling, critical elements of the Allied machine. Perhaps the most striking example came through the Allied air transport system. Women pilots in the Women Air Force Service pilots ferried bombers, fighters, and transports across the U.S. to embarkation points. This freed thousands of male pilots for combat missions overseas. And in Europe, female personnel ensured those aircraft were directed, supplied, and tracked with precision. The Germans had no equivalent structure. Their communication lines were effective but not liberated. They lacked the manpower and womanpower to sustain the war's expanding demands. By limiting women's roles ideologically, they had constrained their own technological reach. So when German auxiliaries saw American WACs stepping out of jeeps with radio equipment slung over their shoulders, or carrying maps and signal packs, it wasn't just symbolic. It was proof that the enemy had fought this war with its full population. To them, this was more than a visual shock. It was a cold, tactical realization. Their country had fought with one arm tied behind its back. The leadership and psychological command angle war does not only shape leaders, it reveals what leadership truly values. In Nazi Germany, leadership was rigid, hierarchical, and almost entirely male. Women existed in the system as obedient auxiliaries, not as decision-makers. A female auxiliary might be competent, even brilliant, but she could not rise. No rank, no command, no influence. Her voice could travel over the radio, but not up the chain of command. The United States operated differently. While American society in the 1940s was still far from equal, the wartime structure opened space for women in unprecedented ways. Officers in the WWII held real rank. They managed units. They signed orders. They trained recruits and supervised operations. They wore insignia that demanded respect, not as decoration but as authority. This difference in leadership philosophy had ripple effects far beyond the battlefield. American female personnel gained confidence not just from their uniforms but from the power behind them. Their authority was institutionally recognized. Male soldiers were required to salute female officers. They followed their commands in the chain of military order. For German auxiliaries raised to see obedience as their ceiling, this was almost incomprehensible. Their entire sense of place in the war and the world was anchored in the idea that men led and women followed. Now, in the final weeks of the war, they stood face to face with women who commanded men. Leadership is also psychological warfare. When an American female officer calmly gave instructions in front of captured German auxiliaries, she did more than coordinate a camp. She embodied the enemy's strength in its purest form, modern, adaptive, and confident. The moral and ideological angle at the heart of the war lay two opposing visions of society. The Nazi worldview was totalitarian, patriarchal, and narrow. A woman's worth was defined by her service to the nation through men. That belief was reinforced daily, from schoolrooms to state media, from uniforms to wedding policies. The American worldview was not perfectly liberal, but it was built on the idea of individual agency. American women could work, vote, choose. They were not equal in every sense, but they were not voiceless either. And in wartime, their country asked them not just to support men, but to stand beside them. For German auxiliaries, this ideological contrast landed like a hammer. Many had believed sincerely in the Reich's ideals. Others had simply never questioned them. But in the presence of American women, that ideology didn't just seem outdated, it seemed small. The Reich had promised them dignity through obedience. The Americans had built dignity through participation. This was not a battlefield victory, but a cultural one. When ideology meets reality, reality tends to win. The emotional silence in that German compound in April 1945 wasn't just about uniforms or radios or ranks. It was the collision of two belief systems. One built walls, the other opened doors, and soon, that collision would reach its most intense point, when German auxiliaries and American WAC personnel stood face to face at the moment of surrender. April 1945, the war was cracking apart at every seam. German units scattered and retreating, left behind radio posts, airfields, and communication centers. Allied columns advanced through this landscape like a slow, inevitable tide. And among the groups of captured personnel were the Helferinnen, female auxiliaries of the once feared German war machine. One of these holding areas sat on the edge of a small airfield in central Germany. Bomb craters marked the runway. A control tower stood with its windows blown out. Inside a wire perimeter, dozens of German women stood in their gray-green uniforms, clutching small bundles of personal belongings. Some wore steel-gray overcoats, others Luftwaffe caps. Their faces carried the blank exhaustion of people who have run out of war. A low rumble grew louder on the road beyond the fence. Jeep engines, American engines. The U.S. Army convoy approached, raising trails of fine dust under the pale spring sky. But it wasn't the sound of engines that made the German auxiliaries fall silent. It was the faces in the jeeps, women, American women, wearing sharp olive drab uniforms, leather boots, side caps tilted with quiet confidence. Some carried clipboards. Others had radios slung over their shoulders. They sat in the jeeps like they belonged there, and because they did. These were members of the Women's Army Corps, part of the communications and administrative detachments advancing with the front. For weeks they had followed the army through France and into Germany, setting up field headquarters, decoding signals, and running message centers. Their presence here wasn't symbolic. It was operational. The convoy slowed. The jeeps rolled to a stop. Boots hit the gravel. American officers, male and female, walked toward the wire gate. What happened next unfolded not with shouting but with stillness. The German auxiliaries straightened instinctively, a remnant of military discipline. But as the American WACs drew closer, something shifted in the air. The Germans' gaze swept over the olive drab uniforms, the crisp tailoring, the rank insignia stitched cleanly onto the fabric. Some noticed the trousers, something they themselves had never been allowed to wear on duty. Others noticed the way these women walked beside men, not behind them. No one spoke. For a few seconds it was as if the war had paused. The first American WAC, a communications officer in her mid-20s, stepped through the gate with an armed escort. She carried herself with quiet efficiency. She began reading off lists, coordinating with the male officer beside her, marking names of the captured personnel. She didn't look like an accessory. She looked like she belonged in command, and that is when it began. A few German auxiliaries lowered their eyes. One wiped her cheek quickly as if ashamed of the emotion spilling out. Another, barely 20 years old, bit her lip until it turned white. One woman in the back whispered something under her breath. Others said nothing at all. The tears that came weren't from fear. They came from something far deeper. The shock of seeing what had been denied all their lives, made real, living, and unshakable. For years they had been told that a woman's place was in the home, in silence, in the service of men. They had built their lives around that belief, worn their uniforms under its shadow. And now, in the fading light of a collapsing Reich, they faced women who stood as equals to the men they served. The WAC officer looked at the German women, not with cruelty, not with triumph, but with the detached calm of someone doing her duty. She moved down the line, clipboard in hand, taking notes, giving orders to the guards. For her, this was routine. For the German auxiliaries, it was the undoing of an entire worldview. Behind the fence, a few began to weep openly. Others clenched their fists, not in anger, but in something closer to despair. Their lives had been shaped by a structure that told them this was impossible. And yet here it was, walking, breathing, commanding. Even the male American soldiers noticed the silence. One sergeant would later describe the atmosphere in accounts recorded after the war. They just froze. They didn't yell, didn't speak. It was like we'd shown them something from another world. In truth, it was not another world. It was the same world, just a different way of living in it. The moment was short. Orders were issued. The German auxiliaries were processed, searched, and assigned to holding areas. But the emotional weight of that silent confrontation hung in the air long after the jeeps rolled away. Because in that single quiet moment, An empire built on control and obedience had cracked not under bombs, but under the simple sight of a woman wearing her own authority. For years, the German auxiliaries had been told a story. They were told that women were meant to support, not lead, to type, not to fight, to serve the men who defended the fatherland. They were told that the enemy was uncivilized, weak, and corrupt. But when they saw the American women arrive on soldiers in their own right, something inside them cracked. These weren't the monsters that the propaganda posters had painted. These were confident, well-fed, well-dressed women. Their eyes weren't downcast. Their hands weren't trembling. They were joking with the men around them, not as servants, but as equals. For the captured auxiliaries, this was like staring into a mirror that reflected everything they'd been denied. They realized that on the other side of the war, women could drive trucks, fly planes, work as mechanics, command units, and build a future. Meanwhile, they had spent the war taking orders, pouring coffee, filing reports, watching men decide the world's fate. The shame was not just in defeat. It was in realizing how small their world had been. One of the guards later wrote in his journal, "They didn't fear us. They feared them, the American girls." The German girls looked at them the way a prisoner looks at the open gate. Tears were not a sign of pain that day. They were the sound of illusions breaking. The war would end just weeks later. The Reich collapsed, the camps were liberated, and the world saw the full horror of what had been done in its name. But for those women behind the wire, something far more personal shifted that day. In the ruins of a broken empire, many German auxiliaries found themselves in a new world order they barely understood. Some were interrogated, some were released, others simply disappeared into the chaos. But the memory of seeing those American women, free, powerful, unafraid, stayed with them for life. It wasn't just uniforms they remembered. It was posture, confidence, freedom. The American women in uniform were part of a massive mobilization. More than 350,000 women served in the U.S. military during the war, as pilots, mechanics, nurses, radio operators, and much more. Their presence on the front lines shattered old boundaries. For many German women, raised in a system that glorified obedience, this was their first glimpse of an alternative, a vision of womanhood that wasn't confined to kitchen walls or secretarial desks. Some former auxiliaries later spoke in interviews about that day, the day they realized their country had not only lost the war, but had also stolen their future. It was strange, one woman recalled decades later. They were women, but not like us. They looked at the world like they owned it. And in that moment I knew, we were the ones in cages. That image, a line of captured German women staring at their American counterparts, became an unspoken symbol of two worlds colliding. One built on control, the other on choice. History books rarely record that silence behind the wire, but it mattered, because sometimes wars are not only lost on battlefields, they're lost in the quiet, in the eyes of those who realize they've been lied to their entire lives. The uniforms left an imprint, not of victory, not of humiliation, but of awakening. The wind moved gently over the wire. The camp was silent now. No shouts, no marching boots, no barked orders in German. Only the distant rumble of Allied trucks leaving for the next front. But something remained in that silence. Not the sound of war, the sound of realization. In those final weeks of World War II, a single moment had peeled back years of propaganda. A row of German female auxiliaries, trained, uniformed, obedient, stood staring at American women in uniform. Free women, soldiers, leaders in their own right. For years, the Nazi state had promised them glory through submission. It had told them they were valuable, but only as extensions of men. Yet here were women who carried radios, drove jeeps, and commanded respect on the front lines. Not props in someone else's empire, participants in shaping their own history. That quiet collision of two ideologies didn't make headlines. No medals were awarded. No photographs captured the weight of that silence. But it was real, and it would ripple far beyond the barbed wire. The American women would return home to their own battles, for recognition, for equality, for a place in the world they'd helped defend. The German auxiliaries would return to rubble, facing questions no one dared ask during the war. And somewhere between them, in that brief moment of recognition, history shifted by a fraction of a degree. Because wars are not only fought with tanks and planes, they're fought with ideas, and sometimes the most powerful weapon is the sight of what freedom looks like. The uniforms may have been different, but the gaze, steady, defiant, unafraid, said everything. This was the day German officers wept, not for their defeat, but for the future they had never been allowed to imagine.